The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Yes, good morning, and welcome to the ILSO Advisor webinar, Effective Weed Management on Enlist E3 soybean acres, brought to you by the Illinois Soybean Checkoff. I am Dan Davidson, and I will be moderating the webinar today. Just a couple of housekeeping details to get started. If you included your CCA number when you registered for this webinar and you stay with us for the entire presentation, your number will be automatically submitted for one CEU in pest management. If you're listening to the recording of this webinar, you will need to go to the Certified Crop Advisor website, log into your account, and apply for a self-study credit. You can ask questions during the webinar by submitting them using the chat feature in the dashboard on the right side of your screen. There will be time for questions and answers at the end of the presentation. Please keep your questions brief and to the point. I'd like to introduce today's presenter, Shawna Hubbard. She is the Enlist Herbicides Product Manager with Corteva Agrisciences and Agriculture Division of Dow DuPont. In her current role, she works closely with stakeholders in the seed business and crop protection business to oversee Enlist training efforts and content so farmers, applicators, and retailers know how to get the most out of the Enlist weed control system in soybeans. Again, on behalf of the Illinois Soybean Association and the Checkoff, I want to thank you for coming online today and listening to this webinar. And at this point, I'll turn it over to you now, Shawna.
Thanks a lot, Dan. Appreciate that. And thanks to those of you listening today. Sincerely hope you're listening from the cab today and able to get out into the field. Thanks for spending a few minutes with us to talk about the Enlist weed control system. Today, I want to cover weed management focus with Enlist E3 soybeans and Enlist herbicides. As we think about managing weeds with the Enlist weed control system, we'll start here at really reviewing what is the trait, how does the system work. A couple of key words and themes that we'll hit throughout the presentation this morning is options, flexibility, exceptional weed control. As we look at the weed management options that are enabled by 3 tolerances in the E3 trait and exceptional control that's provided by the 2,4-D choline in Enlist 1 and Enlist Duo herbicides, we think it provides a lot of benefit for farmers and applicators looking for a new way to manage those tough and resistant weeds on the farm. As we think about the Enlist weed control system and review a little bit of where we are in the marketplace, it's helpful to think of the status of each of our components of the Enlist weed control system. We've got 3 different traits that are part of our system. The Enlist trait in corn, cotton, and of course Enlist E3 soybeans. We have 2 herbicides in our system. Enlist Duo, it's a premix of 2,4-D choline and glyphosate, and Enlist 1, our straight goods 2,4-D choline product. That's the herbicide piece of our system. Lastly, and very importantly, we've got the Enlist Ahead component of our system. That's our management resource that has been part of our system since the beginning. We actually launched Enlist Ahead in 2012, well before any of our other components were commercial. And Enlist Ahead is really about helping us manage weed resistance and helping us keep sprays on target. So that stewardship aspect of our system has been really baked in from the beginning. It's been a focus for us to keep this system effective and sustainable. So in the commercial marketplace, we have had our cotton trait in the market the longest. We're going into our 3rd commercial year in our cotton business. Last year, we sprayed about 1.5 million acres of Enlist cotton with Enlist herbicides. So that's been a growth story for us in the cotton belt. We're in our 2nd commercial year with Enlist corn. Enlist corn has tolerance to 2,4-D choline, glyphosate, and the FOP herbicides. Quizalofop with the Assure 2 brand is registered for use on Enlist corn, providing an additional tool in grass control. So Enlist corn is commercially available, new option there for weed management. Now, very exciting for us this winter, we were able to fully commercially launch Enlist E3 soybeans. That followed import approval that we received from both China and the Philippines for that trait. So far in 2019, we've been focusing on initial commercial volumes through many different seed brands. So broad availability has always been our strategy with Enlist E3 soybeans. We expect to have several million acres commercial during the 2019 season. And then for the 2020 season, we are driving toward at least 10% market share in the U.S. soybean market with Enlist E3 soybeans. So very exciting times for us to be able to launch this trait and bring the value of new weed control options to farmers across the Corn Belt and across the entire U.S. A little bit of background on our herbicides. Enlist Duo was launched in 2015, and Enlist One was fully commercialized last year. We'll talk more later in the presentation about the properties of 2,4-D choline with Colex-D technology and how they behave differently than traditional 2,4-D products. Now, to dig in a little bit more on Enlist E3 soybeans, what are they and what are the benefits? The 3 in E3 stands for 3 herbicide tolerances. E3 beans are tolerant to 2,4-D choline, glyphosate, and glufosinate. So we've got 3 post-emergence options that can be sprayed over top of E3 beans. We do find that glufosinate is a really critical tolerance for us to complement what we gain with 2,4-D choline tolerance. Again, flexibility and options is what we're all about here in enabling folks to design a program approach that fits their particular E3 acre. So really, exceptional weed control, easy to use and flexible options, and thinking about the yield protection that we get from the ability to control those tough weeds. That's what we're talking about here with the advanced technology in Enlist E3 soybeans. I do think it's important to note that E3 beans do not have tolerance to dicamba, as we now have many different systems in the marketplace. Important for us to remember which traits are tolerant to which herbicides, and E3 soybeans are not tolerant to dicamba. Same vice versa, Extend soybeans are not tolerant to 2,4-D. So just important to keep straight what traits are tolerant to what herbicides. To get into a little bit more background on Enlist herbicides, we have 2 options in our portfolio. Like I mentioned, Enlist Duo is a convenient premix blend of 2,4-D choline and glyphosate. So for those looking for that convenience of 2 modes of action in one jug, Enlist Duo is going to be the way to go for that. Particularly where glyphosate is still effective and you've got grass pressure, Enlist Duo is a great choice. Enlist One is our straight goods product, and flexibility is the key word there. Enlist One does have a lot of qualified tank mix partners on enlisttankmix.com, including glufosinate. So as we think about acres with a high level of glyphosate resistance, really heavy pressure from water hemp or even Palmer amaranth, some of those tough weeds, the tank mix of glufosinate and Enlist One can be super effective in those circumstances. So Enlist One has increased flexibility for tank mixing. Both products do contain 2,4-D choline with Colex-D technology, which helps our sprays land and stay on target. And Enlist One and Enlist Duo are the only 2,4-D containing products that are labeled for use on Enlist crops. let's talk a little bit about weed pressure now. So as we look at the various technologies on the market today, obviously all of the manufacturers of those products are trying to put more tools forward to help us with problems of resistance. Certainly in the state of Illinois, water hemp is a great example of why we need those additional tools, right? So 2,4-D choline targets many different broadleaf weeds. And as we think about using the entire Enlist system, including leveraging those multiple tolerances, we are out to provide better tools for managing those glyphosate-resistant weeds, even tough weeds, right? So let's talk a little bit more about the program approach with the Enlist system. Thinking about how we plan our season with weed control. What we recommend from Corteva with the Enlist system is very similar to what you see from university and extension folks in recommending that we go back to the basics of a really solid season-long plan. And that's going to begin with tillage or burn down to start clean. Enlist herbicides are labeled for burn down use, and one great benefit of those practices is that there is no plant back restriction. If you use Enlist 1 or Enlist Duo in burn down, there's no plant back restriction for Enlist soybeans. So that allows you to plant right after you've done your burn down. When your window gets tight, that can be an excellent benefit. Our next step then, of course, is to apply a soil residual herbicide. What's up on the slide here are options from Corteva. But as you think about what fits your acre, we want to be thinking in terms of effective modes of action in the residual. With water hemp, there's an example of additional resistances that are developing. So as we go into the residual pre-stage, to think about not just metolachlor, but other effective modes of action, and even a premix in the residual stage. So something like a Trivence product with flumi, chlorimuron, metribuzin, looking for multiple modes of action that are, of course, different than our post modes of action. Next step then, post, is to apply our timely post application of Enlist herbicides. Thinking about the application window for Enlist on E3 beans, we've got flexibility there to go through the R2 stage with Enlist herbicides. Important to know with the application window, there are no state cutoff dates for Enlist herbicides. There's also no restriction on days after planting for Enlist herbicides on E3 beans. So as we think about a wider application window, again, back to our theme of flexibility, we can apply Enlist Duo, Enlist 1, up to R2 as needed and still be fully within our labeled window. As we think about the post, I mentioned earlier we can use a glufosinate tank mix with Enlist 1. Glufosinate is labeled up through R1, and that really packs a punch as we get into heavy weed pressure and could be a fantastic tool for dealing with water hemp especially. We can make up to 3 applications of Enlist herbicides on an Enlist acre per season. So we can spray Enlist in the burn down, then we can spray up to 2 passes post with Enlist herbicides. As we think about our plan in post, a couple important things to note as you're planning what to spray. If we do have really heavy weed pressure, you could consider a layered residual in the post to give you a little bit of additional coverage. As you're thinking about the weed management plan, you can take a look at the products that are listed on enlisttankmix.com that will tell you which products are qualified to be put in the tank mix with Enlist 1, Enlist Duo. The label says we need to check that tank mix site no more than 7 days ahead of the time you spray. Like I said, while we do have many options on both herbicides, you're going to find that there are additional options on Enlist 1, not only for herbicides, but also insecticides, fungicides, and many additive and adjuvant products. So keep in mind enlisttankmix.com as you plan those passes. And with E3 soybeans, we want to make sure that we go back to the basics of sound weed management plan. Start clean, use our residual, and make timely post passes. Thinking about label requirements and best practices for coverage and control so that we're managing weeds the way we want to see that. A couple of tips and reminders. First, use full rates for best weed management. And especially as we look at something like water hemp, think through, what Aaron Hager has written about that, what many in the extension and university community are talking about in that area. Let's not cut rates. It's 2 pints per acre of Enlist 1, 4.75 pints per acre for Enlist Duo. Our carrier volume for an Enlist product is 10 to 15 gallons of water per acre. Then, of course, how tall are our weeds? We want to be targeting 6 inches tall or less with Enlist herbicides. And then, of course, spray when weeds are actively growing. Okay? So use full rates, 10 to 15 gallons per acre of water, and spray timely when weeds are small. With that, we're going to go into our second section of content here this morning. We're going to talk a little bit more about 2,4-D choline and Colex-D technology. So the hallmarks of 2,4-D choline with Colex-D is that we've got near zero volatility and reduced potential for physical drift. So we'll go through a little bit more about what that means. In terms of volatility, 2,4-D choline is a different form of ester or an amine that has much better handling characteristics. So I always say with 2,4-D choline, think of it as all the efficacy you know from 2,4-D with drastically different handling characteristics and volatility profile. In comparing choline to ester, we have a 96% volatility reduction with 2,4-D choline. Choline is a different salt than an amine or an ester, one that has a tendency to stay together with the technical 2,4-D acid, and that's where we get our increased stability. This chart here shows you the difference in ester, amine, and 2,4-D choline. Again, you can see that drastic reduction in volatility, 96% less volatile than an ester with our 2,4-D choline product. 2,4-D choline is proprietary to Corteva, and the reason that only Enlist 1 and Enlist Duo are labeled for use with Enlist crops. We knew as we wanted to bring forward a new weed control system that we did need a 2,4-D product that had really different behavior than traditional forms that had been available. So that's really the motivation for why the 2,4-D choline was developed and why it's the only labeled herbicide on Enlist crops. Now, in terms of drift, our products with 2,4-D choline and Colex-D technology also have a reduction for physical drift potential. The photos up on the slide right now show you the difference in spray droplet profile. From the photo on the left is a tank mix of traditional glyphosate and 2,4-D to the photo on the right, Enlist Duo, our premix of 2,4-D choline. and glyphosate. So we have a 90% reduction of driftable fines, physical drift potential, with Enlist herbicides versus traditional 2,4-D. Our formulations team, again, with that directive to make a herbicide that performs and behaves a lot better in terms of staying on target, that's where we get our drift reduction piece in 2,4-D choline with ColXD technology. I will say, though, it's critical on the topic of managing drift. It's critical that we do use the correct labeled nozzles for Enlist herbicide. So as we think collectively about managing physical drift, a couple of components come into play. Number one, definitely the formulation change helps us reduce the potential for physical drift. Number two, you'll find on the Enlist herbicide labels the qualified nozzles and pressure ranges for use with Enlist herbicide. We must use the right nozzles in order to control those driftable fines, but you will find 23 nozzles labeled for use with Enlist Duo and 47 labeled for use with Enlist One. So we do have options there. The third thing that comes into play in terms of managing drift is the applicator's responsibility in following the guidelines on the label that are meant to mitigate physical drift potential. So we'll get ready to go through the next section of our presentation here, which is really going to focus on preparing for and executing applications with Enlist herbicides. And like I said, while we do have a better formulation, it's important that we use the right nozzles and that we don't get tripped up by environmental conditions or something going wrong with our equipment setup. All of that works together to make sure that we have mitigated the potential for physical drift. I should mention with nozzles that you can find the list of qualified nozzles on the herbicide labels for Enlist One and Enlist Duo, as well as on enlist.com. When you go there to check the tank mix list, you will also find the labeled nozzles and pressure ranges for use with Enlist herbicide. Now I want to get into the third section of the presentation here, specifically around making applications and how we do that successfully. This slide here shows a summary of information that can be found in the Enlist Herbicide Application Guide. And this really breaks it down for us into the most important things that we need to be thinking about before we spray, as we spray, and after we spray. So this checklist format helps us think about, number one, what's the growth stage of my Enlist crop? Just make sure in E3 beans that we're spraying no later than R2 stage. But remember, we've got flexibility all the way up through R2 with Enlist herbicides on E3 beans. Secondly there, checking the tank mix website for tank mix products. Number three, check that website or the label for the correct nozzles. And then of course, make sure that our sprayer is clean to start with. Don't get off on the wrong foot, starting with a contaminated sprayer from the get-go. We're going to talk more in a few slides about understanding weather conditions and our surrounding landscape before we spray Enlist herbicides. We want to make sure that we're in the 3 to 10 miles per hour range on wind speed, make sure we're avoiding temperature inversions, and understand what's around us in terms of susceptible crops. And we'll go into more detail on that in just a minute. The bottom part of our checklist on this slide here covers spray volume. Again, that's 10 to 15 gallons per acre of carrier. Our rates, use our high rates, 2 pints per acre with Enlist One, 4.7 pints per acre with Enlist Duo. Make sure that we've got our pressure correlated to the qualified nozzle that's on the sprayer. And then boom height. Our label says make sure that you check the nozzle manufacturer recommendation for boom height, but that's typically going to be around 24 inches above crop canopy. So let's dig in a little bit more on our checklist items here. So knowing what's around us is critical to make sure, again, that we plan our spray accordingly, we stay within the label guidelines, and we do all we can as applicators to mitigate physical drift. So wind speed. Wind speed between 3 to 10 miles per hour is the recommended range. The federal label wind speed maximum is 15 miles per hour, and the state of Illinois doesn't have any special requirements around wind speed for Enlist herbicides. So recommended range, 3 to 10 miles per hour, label maximum 15. One item to keep an eye on in terms of wind direction, which is very important for us to understand before we spray and as we spray. You think, how many times does the wind blow perfectly straight during our application? If you happen to be near or adjacent to a susceptible crop, something like tomatoes, we want to make sure that we don't get into a situation where a shifting wind starts to blow toward those tomatoes during our application. So taking care where we are adjacent and parallel to susceptible crops is important. Want to keep an eye on that wind direction and wind speed, not just before we spray, but also during our application. Then lastly here, temperature inversions. We don't want to spray into an inversion, and that's part of the reason that our recommended wind speed is don't spray during a time that's less than 3 miles per hour wind speed. So a temperature inversion is when a layer of warmer air is sitting on top of a layer of cooler air. And when we spray into a temperature inversion and the physical droplets get caught up in that inversion, we see that they don't move vertically into the atmosphere, but they move laterally. Okay, so an inversion can pick up your spray droplets and move that somewhere else, which results in a application that is not maximized, right? Because our spray didn't land where we wanted it to, and that's a type of off-target movement. Okay, so the things we want to be looking out for in terms of identifying a temperature inversion is low or no wind. That's not a good thing. We want to be in that 3 to 10 miles per hour range. Fog is a good visual indicator of a temperature inversion, although it might not always be present if you have low humidity conditions. And then the differential between the temperature between the nighttime low and when you're spraying. Of course, the dawn and dusk time periods can be a more frequent occurrence of a temperature inversion. So just be sure that we're double checking around that time period. I will say though, there is no time of day restriction on application of Enlist herbicides. So as long as the applicator has checked the conditions and verified that there is not a temperature inversion, there is no label restriction on what time of day you may spray Enlist herbicides. So that was environmental conditions when we're spraying. Now let's talk a little bit about equipment setup. Nozzles and pressure ranges, we've talked about a couple of times. Boom height, again, typically 24 inches or less above crop canopy. And then making sure that we start with a clean sprayer as we go. All of those are important as we go through our pre-spray checklist. One thing to point out around sprayer cleanout and equipment sanitizing is, one of the things that we have seen in cotton country with the Enlist system is that folks have a pretty good idea of sprayer cleanout and particularly tank cleanout. After a couple of years on the market with new technologies and auxin herbicides where cleanout is of course critical, we see that people do have a pretty good understanding of sprayer and tank cleanout. Where we can get caught up is the nooks and crannies of the sprayer, if you will, the small pieces and parts that could be overlooked: hoses, screens, filters, dead ends on the boom, as well as transfer equipment. So it's really about thinking about all the pieces of equipment that touch that herbicide and just making sure that we've done a really thorough job of cleanout using a triple rinse procedure for your spray equipment that's found on the Enlist herbicide label, as well as our product use guide and other literature that describes that triple rinse process. So just really paying attention to thorough cleanout. Now, that triple rinse procedure, you might ask, is that different than other products? It's the same type of triple rinse that is recommended with dicamba products, and you think about many products over the year that you don't want to leave sitting in your sprayer. We do think that triple rinse is good practice and practical on the operation. It's possible to do really thorough cleanout, and it's a good practice whether you're spraying Enlist or you're spraying something else. All right, now I want to spend a few minutes around the surrounding landscape when we spray Enlist, wind direction, and buffers. As we think about new technologies and following herbicide labels, this area is one where we spend probably the most time in education. And there's three key concepts that we need to cover in order to think through field scenarios and how we're going to plan our sprays. So three key concepts here: susceptible crops, sensitive areas, and non-susceptible crops. I'm going to go to the next slides where we get into more detail on each of these three items. Again, understanding these things helps us plan our sprays. So a susceptible crop, as defined on Enlist herbicide label, is a plant that does not have really any or very low natural tolerance to 2,4-D. Examples of susceptible crops are grapes, fruiting vegetables, tomatoes, items that you might find in the state of Illinois. Okay? When we do have a susceptible plant or susceptible crop, and we look at wind direction, it's important to know that susceptible crop isn't a matter of a buffer when we're planning our spray. Okay? If a susceptible crop is adjacent downwind from the field that you're planning to spray, then you would actually not spray in that situation. Okay, so if wind is blowing toward an adjacent susceptible crop, we do not spray Enlist herbicides. So again, that's our vineyards, our high-value specialty cucurbit or vegetable crops, tomatoes. Those are examples of what is a susceptible crop to Enlist herbicides. Now you'll see, if you look at the graphic on this slide, the graphic on the left is illustrating what I was just talking about there. Wind is blowing toward tomatoes, you don't spray. Now, if you are next to tomatoes and the wind is blowing away from the tomato field, you are okay to spray. And again, buffers don't come into play here. It's really a yes or no decision around a susceptible crop, depending on which way the wind is blowing. So that's our first key concept here. second key concept is our non-susceptible crops. And when you think about compatibility and the ease of incorporating Enlist onto your operations, the non-susceptible crops are really important for us in terms of field planning and perhaps managing multiple technologies on an operation. Non-susceptible crops have some inherent level of tolerance to 2,4-D. And because of the properties of 2,4-D choline with Colex-D technology, not volatilizing and minimize potential for physical drift, you can spray Enlist herbicides when a non-susceptible crop is downwind. One big difference from the Enlist system versus the dicamba system is that soybeans are not listed as a susceptible or sensitive crop on the Enlist herbicide label. So if you see the graphic on the slide here, that means if we have got an Enlist E3 soybean field right next to any other type of soybean field, whether that's conventional, Liberty, Extend, doesn't matter what the trait package is in those other soybeans. If we've got E3 right next to it, and even if the wind is blowing toward that other soybean field, we can still apply Enlist herbicides. Other crops that are not listed as susceptible on the Enlist labels are corn, wheat, alfalfa, sorghum. So again, kind of leveraging the non-susceptible crops on our operation, the Enlist system can be really compatible with what you're already doing on the farm, particularly for those soybeans without the Enlist trait. So that's concept number 2. Last concept we need to cover is sensitive areas and wind directional buffers. So as we know, over the last couple of years, buffers have gotten more attention on herbicide labels lately, especially in trait herbicide systems. With Enlist products, we do have a 30-foot wind directional buffer. So if the wind is blowing toward any area that may be a habitat for endangered species, any area that is not listed as an exception to where you need a buffer, then we do have to leave a 30-foot downwind buffer. So a tree line is a great example. If we have wind blowing toward a tree line on the edge of your field, the label requires you to back off 30 feet within the field. So again, this is dependent on wind direction and dependent on what is downwind from you. Now, if you have a planted agricultural field downwind or a fallow field or a building, you do not have to leave a buffer from those type of areas. So again, we're talking about sensitive areas that may be a potential habitat of endangered species. Enlist herbicides have a 30-foot wind directional buffer from those areas. Tree line, lawn, pasture, wooded area, those are all examples of types of areas where we would have the downwind buffer coming into play. Okay, so now we've covered susceptible crops, non-susceptible crops, and sensitive areas. I want to go over a few slides now with field scenarios that hopefully kind of brings those 3 concepts home in terms of sprays. So the scenario on the screen here is if we have wind that is blowing toward non-Enlist soybeans, in this case, Liberty Link soybeans, the wind is blowing at 3 to 10 miles per hour, should we spray? As we think about that, again, key things, we know the wind speed, that's within our recommended range, 3 to 10 miles per hour. Wind direction, we are blowing toward adjacent non-enlist soybeans. Can we spray? Here, you can see more explanation on the slide. The answer is yes, we can spray with wind blowing toward adjacent non-enlist soybeans. So buffers don't come into play in this scenario because what's adjacent downwind from us is not a sensitive area. Liberty length beans are not a susceptible crop, and therefore we are good to spray. We do note on the left side of the graphic here, we have a road and then tomatoes. If you remember back to our discussion on wind direction, one thing to look out for is shifting winds. Okay, so right now the wind is blowing parallel to a susceptible crop. That's the tomatoes that are across the road. And we should be conscious if the wind shifts toward the west and started to blow toward the tomatoes. At that point, we would want to stop our application, since that would be a scenario where the wind is blowing toward the susceptible crop. So just keep an eye out for that shifting wind direction if you are around a susceptible crop. Here's another scenario, and we're really illustrating the same points here. Wind is now blowing toward Roundup Ready corn. Question, should we spray our Enlist soybeans in this scenario? Answer is yes, same principles we talked about in the last situation. Corn is not a susceptible crop, and we don't have buffers coming into play here because we do not have a sensitive area downwind. Next situation here, we have wind blowing toward a vineyard that's across the road from our Enlist soybean field. So recalling our conversation on susceptible crops, grapes in our vineyard are considered a susceptible crop. This scenario is a do not spray situation. You might say, hey, there's a road separating our Enlist soybean field and our vineyard. However, a road is not a far enough distance to, let's call it, protect your vineyard. Okay? So even though we've got the right wind speed, we'll assume we've got the right sprayer set up, we use the right nozzles, okay? We still need to use extra caution around those susceptible crops. And at this situation here, we would have a do not spray scenario. When you can visually see a susceptible crop downwind from you, that is a time that you would, especially around a high value crop, want to make a good decision there and do not spray when a susceptible crop is downwind. Remembering though that our Enlist E3 soybeans do have two other post-merge tolerances. We've got glufosinate and we've got glyphosate. So there we do have additional options. If you need to spray and you need to spray before you get the correct wind, you can utilize that glufosinate or glyphosate. Okay, we're rolling toward the end of the slides here. Just wanted to put this slide up in terms of some key advantages of Enlist herbicides, things we've talked about already today. This helps us sum up. The first thing you see there, soybeans are not a susceptible crop. So this gives us additional flexibility when we're working around non-enlist soybeans. We could still spray even if non-enlist soybeans are downwind. We talked about the differentiation of 2,4-D choline with Colex-D versus other types of traditional 2,4-D. Better behavior means that we have more opportunities to use Enlist herbicide. And one other thing there with 2,4-D choline is there is no low pH advisory on Enlist herbicide labels, so that gives us more tank mix flexibility. We talked about the wide application window. We can spray Enlist herbicides on E3 beans through the R2 stage. There are no state cutoff dates or planting date cutoffs for Enlist herbicides. Enlist herbicides are also not restricted use pesticides. It just gives our applicators more freedom to operate in a number of ways there. We can have folks who are under a certified applicator supervision spray Enlist herbicides. As well, there are no time of day restrictions on Enlist herbicides, as long as we're doing our diligence and making sure that we're not spraying into a temperature inversion. Enlist 1 has great tank mix flexibility. Multiple glufosinate options are on the qualified tank mix list for Enlist 1. That combo really packs a punch, particularly on resistant water hemp and palmer. Another important note is that we can tank mix AMS with Enlist herbicides. No restrictions there. From a convenience standpoint, we offer Enlist Duo, that blend of 2,4-D choline and glyphosate. For those folks who want multiple modes of action in one tank, and particularly if you have grass pressure, great convenient option. And then lastly, what we just talked about in spray scenarios, minimal buffers around sensitive areas, just a 30-foot downwind buffer. Omnidirectional buffers don't come into play for Enlist. So as we wrap up here and get ready to take some questions, I'll leave you with this slide here on where to find more resources. Enlist.com really has a wealth of different literature and information. If you're looking to go a little bit deeper in training, you can do Enlist 360 training found on Enlist.com. You can also find our labels, our qualified tank mix list, qualified nozzle and pressure list on Enlist.com. Then additionally, there's our product use guide, which is kind of an illustrated version of the herbicide label, our application guide, which is the checklist we talked about earlier, and other literature videos, as well as hearing from other growers who have used the Enlist system. So with that, that's the end of my prepared slides. Dan, if we're ready now, we have a few minutes for questions.
All right, Shawna, thank you very much for that very, very thorough presentation. You covered a lot of stuff. The one question that came in, and I have, you talked about, well, the question that was posted, were non-traded soybeans considered susceptible? So in using your example of that figure you had Enlist soybeans and Liberty soybeans to the south, and you had wind going from the downwind to the south on the Liberty beans, and soybeans aren't listed as susceptible, but yet if you spray 2,4-D on soybeans, normally it's going to damage them. So we're not making the connection here how soybeans, non-Enlist soybeans are not considered susceptible. Can you explain that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're getting around the concept of relative sensitivity of soybeans. Now, if you sprayed 2,4-D at a labeled rate on non-Enlist soybeans, no, that's not going to be good for you. So how do we get the classification not susceptible? There is some level of inherent tolerance in soybeans, different than, compare it to a susceptible crop, right? Tomatoes, not inherently tolerant to 2,4-D. So when we look at some level of inherent tolerance, and then the on-target behavior of Enlist herbicides, where we see that there's reduced potential for physical drift and volatility, that's where we get the non-susceptible classification. Now, if you do spray and the wind is blowing toward adjacent soybeans that are literally right next to your Enlist soybeans, and you sprayed right up next to them, will you see some impact on a couple of rows of non-enlist soybeans? Yes, you will probably see a minimal impact of that, but you are not going to see that beyond a couple of rows. So we got to pay attention to wind direction, and sometimes we joke, right? It depends on if those soybeans, are they yours or do they belong to someone, a neighbor that you're not too happy with, right? You are going to see minimal impact, but it's not going to be anything that impacts yield. And if you want to be safe, leave a couple rows. I hope that helps clarify.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying now. That was a big question here I wasn't clear on. On this buffer strip, another question on the buffer strip, you leave this buffer strip at 30 feet because there's something downwind that's susceptible. What are people supposed to do with that 30-foot strip when they have a 100-foot sprayer or a 120-foot boom? What do you do with the 30-foot strip you're not spraying?
Yep. So the buffer, again, comes into play for that sensitive area. And think about, that 30 feet, how would you be managing it if you weren't spraying Enlist? And we have the glyphosate and glufosinate options. So that 30 feet, that's just a different approach. Or let's say this, if you can wait until the wind is blowing away from the sensitive area, away from the tree line, you can spray right up to the edge. So if possible, the easiest approach is wait till you have the right wind so you don't have to leave that buffer.
That, for a custom applicator, yeah, that would make the most sense. Wait another day or see if you have enough flexibility here that you could wait until the wind's blowing away from that susceptible crop, the sensitive area, so you don't have to leave a 30-foot buffer that's going to be hard to manage with a 120-foot boom later. So that makes sense. Yep. This is another question. Can you compare the volatility of Enlist with XtendiMax or Eugenia? We know we have this vapor drift that occurs with that dicamba products. How do you compare the volatility of Enlist with the new dicamba products?
Yep. So a couple of things on that comparison. Really, as we think about where volatility comes from, it's if the acid form of the product, whether we're talking about 2,4-D or dicamba, if the acid disconnects from the formulated salt, the acid is what can volatilize and cause us problems. As we think about the starting point for dicamba products versus Enlist products, 2,4-D, on an acid-to-acid basis, 2,4-D is 236 times less volatile than dicamba. So for the Enlist system, we just started with a molecule that was easier to wrangle. Then in terms of formulation, the 2,4-D choline is connected to the choline, the 2,4-D acid is connected to the choline salt, and that acid and salt are oppositely charged. That helps 2,4-D choline really hang together. So as we compare a dicamba glyphosate mix to Enlist Duo, which is our 2,4-D choline premix, it would be about 98% less volatile than the glyphosate BATMA salt dicamba mix. So it's pretty dramatic. Again, it's that different starting point of inherent volatility in the acid and then the difference in formulation with the salt.
Okay. Another with dicamba, the dicamba product lines, you can't include AMS because it increases volatility. So with the 2,4-D choline, are there anything working with that formulation? Are there anything that applicators have to avoid in terms of mixing?
Yeah, great question to follow up on our last question. So it's really the volatility profile of the herbicide that dictates what restrictions are in play. like I said, it's acidification of the dicamba product that causes us to have that pH advisory. So AMS is an acidifier, as is glufosinate, as is like a DMA glyphosate. Those are all acidifiers, and they break the bond between the dicamba acid and the salt formulation. That's why there's an AMS prohibition with dicamba, because as we acidify, our potential for volatility goes up. But with Enlist herbicides, there's no prohibition on AMS. It's due to that inherently more stable and much less volatile product with 2,4-D choline that you're able to add AMS. We can tank mix Enlist 1 with glufosinate, and there's not acidification that overcomes the 2,4-D choline formulation.
So there are really no special surfactant requirements when mixing Enlist Dual or Enlist 1, no special surfactant requirements?
That's correct. The Enlist labels do not require any additional products into the tank. Again, this is from a herbicide label standpoint. There is no prescribed DRA. So we always say, yes, Enlist herbicides are a fully loaded product, but be sure you're talking with your local retailer for the best recommendations of what to put in the tank with Enlist. In terms of a water conditioner, AMS, defoamer, there's plenty of options available on enlisttankmix.com.
Okay. Do you anticipate, I mean, with the whole, I hate to compare all this to dicamba, I'm sorry, these questions, but you know, in dicamba now you got to be a certified applicator. You have to get you have to go through training to apply dicamba to prevent all these problems we had a couple of years ago. Do you anticipate any kind of certification with Enlist?
I don't. There's not currently certifications from a federal label perspective, and you know we do have to talk about the dicamba comparison. That's folks' frame of reference. Realize that's the dominant trait system on the marketplace these days. So our questions are going to be, hey, how is Enlist similar or not similar to dicamba? So there's no federal training requirement for Enlist herbicides. Although I would say, Dan, you know, we have a team of folks in the field whose whole job is to conduct trainings on Enlist. And being the provider of both the trait and the herbicide, it's in the best interest of Corteva and all our customers that we have a really robust training effort. So just like we're doing here today, there's folks all over the country getting classroom trainings, online trainings, and then we run in-field demos this summer. So we would like to train and educate as many folks as we can, even though there is no federal requirement for that.
Okay, all right. So can you review? Somebody asked, can you re-review how to spray along road ditches and roadsides? Can you review that again?
Yes, yes, that's a great question because this is a different requirement for Enlist than we see with dicamba. So I'm going to put my slide back to a picture here. Just to help us illustrate. So a road ditch for Enlist herbicides, it is considered a sensitive area. But we know in the label amendments that came out for dicamba in November of last year, they designated road ditches as not a sensitive area any longer. However, Enlist herbicide labels, they weren't reviewed this year, so we're functioning under the previous definition of a sensitive area, which did include a road ditch. So this is kind of a technicality, and it is different than the dicamba herbicide. If you were spraying this field up on the screen here, and there was a ditch along this road, that would technically be a sensitive area, a grassy area, and you would need to leave a 30-foot setback. However, actually in this scenario on the screen, you wouldn't be spraying that anyway, since that wind would be blowing toward the tomatoes. So like we talked about a couple times, if you can get a wind that's not blowing toward that road ditch, that's the most favorable scenario.
Okay. If you put down, use a 2,4-D product as a burn down with glyphosate, and you're going to plant, the advice is always to wait 3 to 5 days, because any kind of build up in the seed trench with 2,4-D can cause seedling deformities. Is the choline formulation any different than that? Does that advice still carry forward as a burn down to wait a few days?
If you were planting non-enlist soybeans, yes, you would still need to leave that plant back period between using enlist herbicide in the burn down and then planting non-enlist soybeans.
And enlist soybeans, you don't have the same restriction?
No restriction if you're planting enlist soybeans.
That's the same with corn? Same with corn?
Corn plant back restriction, I don't believe there is a plant back restriction. I should verify on my label, but non-enlist corn, you know what, Dan, I need to verify that before I say, but it is labeled for burn down use ahead of enlist corn. I'm just not recalling the plant back restriction.
But on the enlist soybeans using 2,4-D choline as a burn down, there's no plant back restriction on enlist beans. That's very interesting. So.
Yeah, and that's true for enlist corn as well. So no plant back restriction if you're coming right behind the burn down with an enlist traded crop.
Okay. All right, I think we've got all our questions. We're just a little bit after 11. Shawna, I want to thank you for your time today and for the great presentation and being very, very thorough, talking about the Enlist 3 soybeans and Enlist Dual and Enlist 1. That concludes our webinar on effective weed management on Enlist E3 soybean acres. You will find this webinar and other soybean and agronomic resources on the Checkoff-funded website, ILSO Advisor. On behalf of the Illinois Soybean Checkoff, we want to thank Shawna for this great presentation and want to thank you for attending this webinar. You can always review it again online at the ILSO Advisor. Thank you for attending and have a great day, and this concludes our webinar. Thank you.